All right, we'll go ahead and get started on our prayer list tonight. We had a call the other day about Jerry Pumphrey's dad, and Jerry's dad is home. He's still not doing very well, and it may just be a matter of time that Jerry wanted to keep him on the prayer list. Kay Timms and her daughter are sick and waiting to be able to get in and get looked at. And then Bob Pound, keep Bob on your prayer list over the next few days or weeks. And so I think that's about all we have for the prayer list tonight. So let's take a moment and pray. Father, we thank you for this time together. Just ask that you bless us and be with us. Lord, help us to understand your word, to grow through this study. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to be here in your house, Lord, and just to gather as your people. Lord, we do pray for these three folks that we mentioned on this night and for those around them that are trying to take care of them. And just that your blessing will be on them and on us and all who gather with us. And all these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we are, of course, in Exodus chapter 6, and we're ready to start verse 13. And we kind of take a reset here. We've been talking about Moses and Aaron and going to meet Pharaoh for the first time, and now we kind of jump back and get the genealogy of Moses. And of course his brother Aaron, and we'll read through. It's kind of long. It's about 14 verses, and then we'll talk about it. Starting with chapter 6, verse 13. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron about the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he commanded them to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. These were the heads of their families, which that term can also mean clans, tribes, and a lot of different things. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn son of Israel, were Hanok and Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. These are the clans of Reuben. The sons of Simeon were Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. These are the clans of Simeon. These were the names of the sons of Levi according to their records: Gershon, Kohath, Merari. Levi lived 137 years. The sons of Gershon by clans were Libni and Shimei. The sons of Kohath were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. Kohath lived 133 years. The sons of Merari were Mali and Mushi. These are the clans of Levi according to their records. Amram married his father's sister Jochebed, who bore him Aaron and Moses. Amram lived 137 years. The sons of Ishar were Korah, Nepheg, and Zikri. The sons of Uzziel were Mishael, Elzaphan, and Sithri. Aaron married Elisheba, daughter of Amminadab and sister of Nahshon, and she bore him Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. The sons of Korah were Asir, Elkanah, Abiasat, and these were the Korahite clans. Eleazar, son of Aaron, married one of the daughters of Putiel, and she bore him Phinehas. These were the heads of the Levite families, clan by clan. It was the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord had said, bring the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. It was the same Moses and Aaron. So, a couple of things real quick about this, and we're not going to go into this part a whole lot in detail. But there's a couple of times that it actually interjects military terms into this. And the first one was here in verse 13, because what did God tell Moses and Aaron, or what did he do, or how did he tell them? Or
he commanded.
Right, he commanded them, and that is the same term that you use in the military for a military command or an order. So this was not they didn't have a choice. That was, and the other part of it wasn't just that they didn't have a choice. It wasn't something they were doing on their own. That God commanded them to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And now we get into all these families, clans, tribes, whatever you want to call them. And how many sons of Israel were there? 12. How many do we list here? 3. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. So why do you think we stop at Levi? Because that's as far as we needed to get, basically. One of the things that's always important within the Jewish genealogies, and with a lot of other people too, is what was the order? Who was the firstborn? Who was the second? Who was the third? Well, we're trying to get to the line of Moses and Aaron. So once we get to the line of Moses and Aaron, we really don't need to go any farther, and so they didn't. So there were 9 more that they don't talk about because at this point in time they're not really relevant. And so you had Reuben, you had Simeon, and it just kind of lays out what the clans are, and then we get to Levi, and we have the 3 sons of Levi, and those are going to play into it quite a bit here as we get forward, and especially when you get into Leviticus and all those sort of things. He had 3 sons, Gershom, Kohath, Merari, and then Levi lived 137 years. And so, he'd been around for a while. It goes into Gershom's sons, Kohath and Merari, and so that divides up those 3 families. And because those 3 families were, like I said, they're going to come into play quite a bit as we move on through it, and with the whole Levitical process and all the different responsibilities. Each one of these families would have a different responsibility within the duties of the Levites, assisting the priest, and all those sort of things. So now it gets into the line that we get down to Amram and Jochebed, and so now there's a couple of different things that people talk about with this, and one of them is there's an Amram who is mentioned earlier but if that was actually Moses' father, then he would have had to have been about 350 years old, because that one is mentioned as being alive when Jacob went down into Egypt to join Joseph, and that we're at about 400 years since then. So chances are that's not the same one. Now, the other way of looking at it, some people, or another of those ways to look at it, is that like they do in some places, that is basically that it doesn't really matter. You get down to here, this is the important one, and they just kind of jump from there down to the next, and they may skip some generations because when it talks about the sons or the parents or the lineage, a lot of times it just means the descendants of, which could be, that several generations. I'm a direct descendant of my father, but I'm also a descendant of his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, and all that. So you could list it a couple of different ways, but don't really think that it matters. The big point that the Bible's trying to make here is that they were Levites. They were able to trace their lineage, because that's also a big thing. You have to be able to trace your lineage back to Israel, for that matter, back to Jacob. So, and if you can get to one of the 12 sons, then you've pretty well got that. So now, when we get down to verse 23, then it actually steps into the next generations. Now, at this point, it looks like Aaron probably had children, and because how old? Do you know how old Aaron is at this point in time? 83. And that's actually going to come up in the next chapter. But he's 83 years old. So we know that he had this first round of sons, Nahshon, and or that was his wife, Nadab and Abihu. Now, those names are going to become really significant because they were selected for some very special stuff of being priest in the next line of priest, and they really messed it up. And some not too good things happened to them. And so then it becomes Eleazar and Ithamar. And all of the priesthoods come from those two guys. And that after they died, and even in the time of Moses, the next generation was there with Eleazar. He married one of the daughters of Putiel, and she bore him Phinehas. And Phinehas is somebody that we're going to be reading about before we get done with the book, and definitely in the next book. And he was a contemporary of Joshua and assisted Joshua quite a bit. So because those names all play in, that's why we have all those things. Now, one of the questions that always comes up is whose sons are missing? Who's the main two characters we're talking about here? Do what? Moses' sons are not listed. Why are Moses' sons not listed? Well, there's a couple of thoughts about that. Number one is they really didn't amount to anything. And what I mean by that is that, they weren't significant. And I'm not saying that, like when we talk about today, we say, man, he didn't amount to anything. It usually means they were about worthless. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, but they didn't rise to prominence is maybe a better way to put it. And there's a couple of views about that maybe Moses spent so much time with the things that he had to do that he didn't have time for his own children. And one of the things I was reading not too long ago was about Nelson Mandela's daughter. And one of the things that she told him once, because they were estranged for a little bit, she said, "You were the father of all of our people, but you never had time to be a father to me." And so, it could be like that. It could be that, Moses didn't train them up to do those things. He just kind of let them on their own. We do know that they kind of went back to their grandfather for a while with their mom, and then he brings them back later on. We're going to see that as we proceed through. So, maybe they didn't have the same passion as Moses, or they were overshadowed. There's a lot of people that have really famous parents, and sometimes it's just being celebrities, singers, actors, actresses, politicians, other great people whose children don't want to follow in their footsteps, don't want to be anything because they felt like they're overshadowed by them. They want to make their own way and their own thing, and you even stop and think about it. Very few really prominent people that do you ever hear about their children as well. There's a few actors and actresses that may happen with, but for the most part, there's not much of that. And so the other part of it is that these sons of Aaron, they rose to prominence. And not so much that they were more special than anybody else, was that they had special roles that God gave them that they're going to be coming up later to fulfill those. Eleazar becomes the next high priest. And then he and Ithamar, all the priestly jobs were divided among them. One of them was more responsible for the worship and all that sort of thing. The other one was responsible for more rituals and taking the tent down of the tabernacle, the altar, transporting everything, setting it back up, being over the administrative things. And one was more over the worship and the ritual things. So we've got it laid out all these times, and that's one of the things that anytime you see something like this interjected, there's a purpose for it, and especially when it ends up with names like these, the Torah is telling us these names are going to become prominent. We talked about that when we went through Genesis. Anytime all of a sudden you'd read somebody's names out of the blue, when it was mentioned in something, it meant that a time was coming that what the Bible's telling us is, remember this name, it's going to come up. And so that's what it is. Now, it's kind of interesting that this whole passage kind of starts and ends the same way. You know, verse 13 said, now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron about the Israelites, and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, commanded them to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. And then we got 26. That was the same Aaron and Moses. So it's the same one. They're saying it's the same one that God commanded to bring them out, that of whom the Lord said, bring the Israelites out of Egypt by their divisions. And that's another military term. That's the second one. The first one was using the command. This one is about their organization. Like we would talk about regiments or divisions or companies. It's one of those kind of military terms. And that's how they would be. That's how they would always move, in that manner. People, they didn't just say, okay, other than when they actually escaped out of Egypt, the rest of the time it was, all right, this tribe goes first, this one goes second, this is a third, fourth, fifth, sixth. These things go in the middle, this goes in, and it moved like a military caravan. And even with their banners, or their colors or whatever, they would have a symbol for the tribe that would go in front of them. And so this is the same ones who spoke to Pharaoh about bringing them out, same Moses and Aaron. It mentions it 4 times, here 3 times, it's the same ones. I want you to understand. They have a line, they are Israelites, both of them. They can trace their genealogy all the way back to Levi. So verse 28. Now, when the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt, he said to him, I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, everything I tell you. But Moses said to the Lord, since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me? Now, have we read that before? We've read that statement before, but what's the difference between the 2 statements? This is the second time that Moses has said the same thing to God. Where was the first one? At the burning bush. And where's the second one?
Before it goes to Pharaoh.
Yeah, so if you look at verse 28, now when the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt. So Moses still got those same kind of things with him and saying, Lord, I don't speak that well. I'm not a fluent speaker. Like I said, there was a period of time which people thought that when they said faltering lips, that he stuttered, he had a lisp or some sort of speech impediment, and probably not. It's more like I just don't speak eloquent. I can't respond back quick enough and those kind of things because actually, and this is just my opinion, if Moses actually stuttered, if Moses had a speech impediment, they would, back in those days, they would have never raised him in the palace. They would have shipped him someplace else, and he wouldn't have had the position that he did. So, chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the people go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt with mighty acts of judgment. I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. So Moses says, Lord, I'm not a public speaker. And what's God say? He said, doesn't matter. He didn't even respond back to that part because he's already addressed that before. I made your mouth, Moses. I can make you talk. And it was kind of what he told him at the burning bush. And here because of, Moses kept throwing up excuses, and God finally told him, said, look, Aaron's coming. He's going to be here. He can do the talking. And so that's what God is saying to Moses here, just kind of matter of fact. Look, he doesn't really address it. He said, here's the plan. I've made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. Now, what's he mean by that?
Well, Aaron's going to speak for him. So
Yeah. You are the... So who thinks that they're God in this thing? Pharaoh does. And so he said, I'm making you God to Pharaoh. I'm putting you over Pharaoh, and you're going to speak to him. In other words, you have more authority, you have more control, you have all those things over Pharaoh, who thinks he's your God, and Aaron will be your prophet. Now, you know, that term prophecy has been misconstrued over the years, the centuries, the millenniums, or whatever. And when we say prophet, the first thing everybody thinks about is what we call prophecy, you know, predicting the future. But the true definition of that word in the Bible, even with Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, and all the rest of them, is spokesperson. And so Aaron will be your spokesperson. And, you know, when on Sunday mornings we've been kind of going through with our readings through Jeremiah. And everybody talks about Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah's stuff, or Jeremiah's messages, we're about to hear now. There was very little, you know, he did talk about in 70 years you're going to come back and all those sort of things. A lot of Isaiah, we always talk about Isaiah and his prophecies of the Messiah coming and all that. But most of Isaiah's book, his prophecies are being a spokesman for God in the here and now. So when he says he's going to be your prophet, it means he's going to be your spokesperson. Not that, you know, that he's going to be foretelling the future or anything like that. So I'm going to put you over Pharaoh. You're going to be God to Pharaoh. In other words, you're going to have more control than he does. Aaron's going to be your spokesperson. So he said, I've already done it. If you notice, it's in past tense. I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and Aaron's your spokesperson. So God's not even, he's not even going there. He's not even letting him have that argument. And so you're to say everything I command you. And who's going to speak to Pharaoh? Yeah, and so you tell, I'm speaking to you. You speak to Aaron. Aaron tells Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of whose country?
His country.
His country. It is Pharaoh's country, but as a king, not as a god. And then we get into that part 2 in verse 3 about hardening Pharaoh's heart. And now, in some of the places, it's about 50-50. In some of the places, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. There were times that he did it. There were times that God did it. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through each of the plagues and what it means. But there's there are reasons for it. I'm going to hit on it a little bit, and that is, you know, everything that comes up from these plagues, all 10 plagues, are a contest to prove, or a demonstration maybe is a better way to do it. A demonstration to prove who is God, who is in control, who runs the universe, including the people in Egypt. Is it Pharaoh or is it God? Now, just like letting the people go, if Pharaoh were to turn them loose right in the very beginning, it would mean Pharaoh had control. So it's got to get to the point that it is a demonstration of God's power, of his authority, of his being almighty over Pharaoh, that it is not about Pharaoh's power and who he is. And that it's not, God's telling Moses again that it's going to be how many times? Multiple. He's not telling him yet 10. He's just telling him it's going to be multiple times. Moses, it's going to be more than once. There's going to be several miracles, and each one of them is going to get bigger and bigger. And remember, these miraculous signs and wonders, the definition of something being miraculous or being a miracle is that it cannot be proven by, it cannot be replicated, it cannot be done within the physical laws of nature. whether it be physics, chemistry, or anything else. And he's going to do them in Egypt. He's not going to listen to you, Moses. So God's making that up front and letting him know that up front, because that's going to affect Moses' attitude. If you're going into somebody and you're really trying to convince them and they're not listening and you think they may be able to listen and they don't, one of two things are going to happen. You're either going to really go back in and try harder or maybe do some things you shouldn't do, or you're going to get discouraged. And what's the point? So God's telling him right off the bat, Moses, he's not going to listen. That's the way it's going to be. Get ready for it. So that Moses isn't shocked and he's not discouraged by all of it. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt with mighty acts of judgment, and I will bring out my divisions. There's that word again, that they're going to come out in sections. My people, the Israelites. He's not bringing out the Egyptians, right? There's going to be the judgment against Egypt. And who's this to know that he's the God? Yeah, that the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, that I am the Almighty, is what that means. Well, El Shaddai actually means God Almighty, but this is the one. Remember, this is the term that he told Moses, I am, but you refer to me as the Yahweh, or as we say today, the Jehovah. And so that they know, my people should already know. My people should know I'm God. The point of all this is to prove that Pharaoh's not God. I am the Lord. And that term, I am the Lord, is one of the most used terms by God for himself in the Bible. And usually those spokesperson things with all those different prophets, it starts off with, thus saith the Lord, and at the end of it, God's last thing is saying, I am the Lord. And every time I read that, I can just think of, when you go through there and God says, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, I am the Lord. I always think back to when I was a kid, you're going to do this, you're going to do this because I'm your mother. It's that kind of authority type thing, and to say who's in charge. And stretch out his hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. And remember, anytime in the Bible, and even in the Psalms, David speaks of it, others speak of it. That's a term all the way through the Old Testament. Stretching out your hand was not, today, some of them refer to stretching out your hand as a handshake and a goodwill gesture. That's not what it meant back then. To stretch out your hand meant you had something in it. You had a knife, a sword, even a bow and arrow. You got to stretch your arm out. It meant battle. It meant force. And so God is saying that when I use force against the Egyptians, I will bring the Israelites out. So they did just as God had commanded. There's the military part again. God is the commander-in-chief here. And 80 years old and 83. You ever stop to think about that? Huh?
That's old.
That's old. And, we talked before, Moses was 40 years old when he left Egypt. He's 80 years old when he gets back. And how old is it when he dies? Anybody remember?
You say 120?
120. It's 40, 40, and 40. So 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the desert, 40 years after he brings them out of Egypt, spending in the desert and the wandering around. So, that's what somebody said. If they'd have put Miriam in charge, she'd have asked directions right off the bat and they'd have got there in a week. So instead of wandering around for 40 days and not knowing where they's going. So, all right, verse 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same thing by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs, yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. So, this is the staff. And just like here, He starts talking, God's talking to Moses and Aaron, but who's he talking to? Moses. When Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron. Well, he's obviously not talking to Aaron there. Throw down, take your staff, throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a what? It actually says it's a different term than just snake. It actually means like monster snake or big snake or something like that. Of course, you know, if your staff is 6 feet long, that's pretty monstrous, the snake. And so he throws it down, and it becomes a snake, and then what happens? Mary Jane ran for the hills. That's what happened.
Right.
So,
Well, then he called in for,
yeah, so it's down there for a while. You got to, you know, it says then what she said was Pharaoh called for his magicians and stuff. Well, it didn't necessarily mean that they were standing right there beside him. They were somewhere. They could have been in the next room or in the palace somewhere or whatever. But wherever they were, they still had to be summoned. So this thing's, it's not just something that happened in 15 seconds. Throw it down, becomes a snake, you pick it back up, and it's all done. This thing's down there wandering around and in front of everybody. It doesn't take off, obviously, and all that. So, and it says in 11, he summoned the wise men and sorcerers and the magicians. And what did they do?
They made snakes.
Same thing with by what? Their secret arts. Now, one of the things that one of the commentaries I was reading said that you know, when you stop and think about even magicians today, what is the main thing that they use? Sleight of hand and illusion. And was this something, you know, now they're being summoned, and I'm sure the person that came to get them said, Pharaoh wants you, these guys out here have thrown their stick down, it's become a snake, he wants you to come and do something about it. So in my opinion, this is my opinion, they came prepared to pull a fast one too. And that's why it doesn't say that you know, that they did it by whatever, it's by their secret arts. So through their illusion, through their trickery, their sorcery, whatever it is. Now there are some that do think that it could have been through demonic things and all of that. So each one threw their staff down and it became a snake. How many were there?
he didn't say it.
That's a trick question. Yeah, it doesn't say. But it says each one. So there was more than one of them. And, you know, there was 3 groups that he was calling. The wise men, the sorcerers, and the magicians. So there could have been several. But what happens?
Moses just eats them, swallows them up.
Now, you know what? I don't know why it is, but that is one scene that I remember about as good as any of them. The old Cecil B. DeMille, Charlton Heston movie was the Aaron snake eating up the other. Probably because the first time I saw it, you know, as a kid and those kind of things. But why do you think that occurred?
Show power,
What?
to show power
What kind of power?
that Moses and Aaron had over Pharaoh's
Yep.
thing.
Yep. And because remember last time we said, what did Pharaoh have on his head, on his crown?
That serpent.
A serpent, you know, kind of up and down, and that was considered a part of the Pharaoh and a part of the gods. So right off the bat, it's saying, mine is bigger than yours. My God can overcome yours. You may have yours, but mine's going to swallow it up. You know, and if there were several snakes, even all of them together did not have the, I don't know if you want to call it the power, or the means or whatever to overcome this snake. And change Pharaoh's mind, right? Nope. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Now this part, it does not say that God had hardened it this time. This is one of those that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He rejected it. So, verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the water. Wait on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take your hand, the staff that was changed into a snake, Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the desert. But until now you have not listened. So this is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. When the staff that is in my hand, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed to blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff, stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams, canals, ponds, and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and stone jars. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed to blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt, but the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went into his palace and did not even take this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. So, God says to Moses, Pharaoh's heart's unyielding. You need to go. This is the next step, and that's what's going to predicate each step. Now, how many plagues were there altogether? 10. Now, if you take out the last one, because that's a separate thing all on its own, you know, the Passover or the death of the firstborns, how many does that leave? 9. There's 3 sets of 3. And all 3 of them follow the same pattern. Number 1 of the 3, which would be 1, 4, and 7. God tells Moses to go meet Pharaoh on the way to the river. The second one of each 3 set, God tells Moses to go to the palace. The third one of all 3 sets, God just tells Moses to do it. There is no interaction with Pharaoh. So it's 3 sets of 3. Each one of them gets greater as it goes along. And so there is an opportunity now the other thing is that it just kind of tells you that, you know, that you got that repetition, 3 threes, and all that, that it is a plan. That it was not something just at random. So you're going to notice that as we go along. First one of the 3, meet him on the river. Second one of the 3, meet him in the palace. Third one of the 3, just do it. So he tells him to go wait at the Nile. And to me, there's a couple of things interesting about that. One of them is that it appears that he went to the Nile about every day. Why would he go to the Nile?
To clean up?
Huh?
To clean up?
Clean up, possibly. That's what probably his sister would have been Moses' or his aunt, the woman that adopted, daughter of Pharaoh that had adopted Moses and all that kind of thing. That's what she was doing. She was going to the river to bathe. And so that could be what Pharaoh was doing. The other thing that he could be doing was going down there to worship. Because what do we say about all the plagues? They are what? A demonstration against the Egyptian gods. Not just Pharaoh, the Egyptian gods. The second most important god that they had was the god of the Nile. Hopta or something along that line. Because it was that god that brought the Nile River, and actually they would pray to that god, and they actually prayed for the floods, and they thought that the god brought them the floods. Now, why do you think they wanted floods?
To water the land.
Hmm?
To water the land.
Well, they could get the water of the land, but you know, once the flood's gone, then the land doesn't get water unless you have rain. The reason for the floods was it brought the silt out of Central Africa from the Ethiopian areas and all that down and deposited it out on the Egyptian ground. So they were always they didn't have fertilizer and stuff back then. This was new fertile ground that came to the Egyptians through the floods. Flood comes in. You know, flood water is always muddy. I'll tell you what, just tell you how muddy it can be. The year we got married, Gail's house flooded. And in April, wasn't it? April or May? April. 94. So she calls me one night. I'm working, and she said, "Hey, I've got to leave the house." I said, "Okay." And she said, "I'm going to go down to Mom and Dad's for the night." I said, "Okay." Said, "The water's coming up around the thing." Well, every once in a while, the water, she lived, the big Vermilion River was right behind her house. Every once in a while, they get out, and it'd be a little bit of water around the driveway and stuff, so I didn't think anything about it. Well, what we found out was at Danville, where it comes out of Lake Vermilion, there had been so much rain over there that they opened the floodgates to let the water out, and a tree got stuck in the floodgates, and they couldn't close them. And the water came up. Her house was 3 feet above the ground, was where the front porch was. The water got up to her windowsills, and everything was locked, everything was closed, all the doors were shut. There were 2 inches of mud everywhere in that house that we had to clean up to begin with. And that's in there. That's with it getting through the windows, getting through the doors, and whatever other leakage places there might have been. So when you think about something like this, and that flood water of the Nile coming down and surging like it would, and as it went out, even if it left 2 inches of mud, and chances are it probably left more than that, that would have been good, loamy dirt. Just like you see, you know, when you look around here, where's the most fertile ground? The river bottoms, for that same reason. And so they didn't, it was also a source of their drinking water for those along the Nile, and fishing and all that kind of stuff that they would do. So the other God, the main God, was the sun god, and we'll get to deal with him later on. So anyway, with all of that, they're going to start with one of the main gods to show who's in control, because this God also controlled the health of the river. So they go down to the river. Pharaoh's coming here. Now, to me, the other part that I think is interesting, and this is just in my mind, I don't really read it anywhere. Everything started with Moses and the first Pharaoh where? At the riverbank. That the daughter of Pharaoh at that time came down to the riverbank. Moses was already there. She saw Moses. She adopted him into the house, after having him nursed for 3 years and all that. Now, the second, whatever in his life, chapter of his life, and this kind of thing we're dealing with starts at the same place. I mean, really gets down to it and gets started down here in the same place, down along the Nile. And so, what's he tell him?
What Moses tells Pharaoh?
Yeah.
Oh, he's going to turn it.
Yeah, he says, the God of the Hebrew, the Lord, he always identifies him, the God of the Hebrews says, "Let my people go." And so in order to make that demonstration, Moses tells who? Aaron. Stretch out your staff over all the waters. Now, could he stretch his staff out over all the water? So what do you think he did? Yeah, he just kind of raised it up, point it this direction, point it that direction, point it this direction, and whatever. And what happens? Yep, all the streams, the canals, the ponds, the reservoirs, they turn to blood. Now, you always get in that thing, well, it wasn't really blood. It might have been. I don't know. It says blood, but it could have been like blood. Now, there's also, I will tell you this as we get ready to get started. There's 2 ways of looking at the plagues. One of those was that these are unique things that God did on the spot. In other words, part of that, the miracle was that as soon as Aaron held his staff up, God says, basically, God says, and it was, and that sort of thing. That as soon as he did, because God said it will hold it up, turn there, it'll turn to blood. The other thing is that the other view, and it goes with a lot of these, we'll kind of make those correlations as we go, is that God used nature to bring about the plan. And where that comes in is it's a fairly regular thing. Sometimes it's every year. A lot of times it may skip a year or two. But remember where we said the Nile really comes from, the water. It winds up, but it basically comes out of Ethiopia as a river and flows north. And now, a couple of things happen. Number one is right before the rainy season, you have what? The dry season. And in Africa, it's like day and night. I mean, they happen literally. It can be dry, the ground flaking off, all that kind of stuff. And you see a storm coming off the horizon and the rain starting to rain for days. What happens to water when there is no fresh water flowing into it, or very little?
It's stagnant.
Yeah, and it gets the wrong kind of. Every year, I didn't hear it. This first year, I haven't heard it in a while. Usually about August, and it's generally on the Indianapolis stations. You know, they talk about they'll list off almost every state lake in Indiana. The blue-green algae. Oh, don't let your dogs drink it. It'll kill your dog. You know, and it's there. And the Corps guy was telling me one time, kind of getting all. He said it's there 12 months out of the year. It's never out of the water, but you get back in these stagnant parts in the summertime, way back in the coves where the boats aren't stirring the water up and all that. He said it may be a problem back there. But the point of it is you get those things. So that happens right before the rains come. It's not like today and tomorrow, but it starts building up as you get those droughts. The algae starts growing, and the bacteria, and there's a name for this bacteria, and it will basically kill everything in the river. And then it has kind of a purpley color to it that it will change. You know, almost like you hear down around Florida and all that about the red tides that come in because of the microorganisms in the water that all turn red and all that kind of stuff, and the water's never good. And it kills the fish, and it does all those kind of things. So there's even some of that over here. The second thing is, you want to guess what color the Ethiopian dirt is? Red. So then the floods come. The rains come, it washes everything down, and everybody knows, you know, that you could have a nice clear stream except when the floods hit, and it'll turn full of mud and silt, and that red dirt comes down. And so between the red dirt that's in the water being rushed down and the bacteria and all those things, that it turns the lake red, that it just so happened that God knew this is going to happen tomorrow, or it's about to happen today. So go down there, be there, hold your staff out, and it just happens to come along that way. That God coordinated the flow of the river with the stuff in it to the very time that it was going to be there. And so some people see that as the miracle, that it is God controlling nature to bring about his plan, where others just see it as God saying, blood, boom, blood. And, you know, that's the way it is. So either way, was it just the Nile?
No.
Nope. And where else was it? The wooden bucket and stone jars.
But why wasn't it in the underground water?
Well, I'm going to get to that here in just a second.
Okay.
Everything, it was pretty well all the exposed, because even in the list, what's not there? Wells. Everything else is there. The reservoirs, ponds, rivers, streams, not the wells. What's different about the wells? And what did they do to get clean water?
They dug along the Nile.
All right. So what happens there?
Ground filtered it.
The ground filters it. Sand or whatever. You know, when you get right down to it, those of you that do not live within the city limits somewhere, what is it that we depend on the ground to do? Filter the sewage water. You know, gets treated, it goes out into your finger system, and the ground purifies it. And it was kind of the same thing. So, which is why they would dig in the sand a ways, and the sand would clean it as it went, and they got it out of the wells. So, you know, it's everywhere in Egypt. And they did it. Moses or Aaron raises his staff. It all changed. And what happened?
Pharaoh calls his people and they do the same thing.
Yep. Now, where did they do it? It doesn't really say. It doesn't say whether it was big water, little water, if it was just some buckets that they drew up out of the, out of the well or whatever, and did their little hocus pocus over it, do some things, and I mean, I got stuff at home. There's a thing called Christ in Chemistry that I used to do years ago, and this stuff's probably 20 years old. But that's one of the things you could do. You could drop one little drop into a big thing of water in a clear container, and it turned just red as blood. So, there's always things like that they could have done, or it doesn't say how they did it. It just said that they did it. But what were the consequences? Well, yeah, let's talk about the consequences. I want to talk about them too. So what were the consequences of it turning into blood?
The fish died and they couldn't drink it.
You couldn't drink it.
The fish died.
The fish died, and it stunk. I mean, now there's two things about it. Number one is it appears that just the river stunk by itself, whether from whatever was in it. And but can you imagine what would happen? I mean, just stop and think if it was, even the big Raccoon Creek out there, or especially the Wabash. If there was a major fish kill in the Wabash, and all those dead fish, what's going to happen to them?
Wash up to the bank.
They're going to go to the bank, and then what's going to happen in the desert? In 100-degree weather. I don't think we can imagine the stink. So now the other thing too was Pharaoh goes and gets his magicians and all that stuff. And what did they actually do? I mean, I know what they did. They changed some water into blood, but what did that actually do? They made it worse. They didn't come along and say, "Hey, Pharaoh, we can fix that. You want to see who's in charge? We'll show you who's got the power. We can fix it." They didn't fix it. They just said, "Yeah, we can do that too." And whether it was a bucket of water, some big thing somewhere, so they actually made it worse. And so Pharaoh's heart became hard. Again, this is not God doing it yet. Did he listen?
No.
Nope. What did he do?
Went into his house.
He turned around, went home. So, and didn't take it to heart. And so then all the Egyptians have to dig for their water. And they could not drink the water out of the river. So that's the first test with the first God, right? About the second most important, not necessarily high on the hierarchy about, who is the top one and whatever, but as far as importance, that was about the most important. So, what time is it? Yeah, we got a couple minutes. 7 days after the Lord struck the Nile, then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs, and I will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace, into your bedroom, onto your bed, into your houses of your officials and your people, and into your ovens and your kneading troughs. The frogs will go up on you and your people and all your officials.'" I'm going to have to look it up there. Let's see. There's a little song that the Jewish kids do. They even do it today. And I was trying to think. Pharaoh had the frogs in his bed. They were on his chest, they were on his head, they were on his toes, they were on his nose, and there's something about there was nothing he could do about it. But that kind of goes along because they recite all the different plagues during the Passover that they still do today, And it just kind of tells you that. But the thing I want to take a couple minutes to talk about before we get out of here is actually verse 25. Now, verse 25 looks like it's part of chapter 8 because they separated down. So how long has the river been in blood?
7 days.
7 days. Now, we get this idea a lot of times, just like we do with everything else, and we've talked about it before. You read through it, and you think it goes from, just like we talked about last time, Moses, him and Aaron are kissing each other's cheek at the mountain of God, and the next thing we read about they're in Egypt. That's about a 1,000-mile walk. So it's kind of the same thing here. They turn all the water into blood, the fish all die. And it's been a week that's going on. So you can imagine what it smells like. The other thing I forgot to mention about the fish, what else is significant about the fish? It doesn't have anything to do with the God from a practical standpoint. Food. Yeah, it was food. That was their protein. They really didn't eat meat too much. They worshiped most of the other gods. So, and you'll see Egyptians still today fishing out of their little boats on the Nile and all of that. So a week's passed, and the stink's getting worse. And those kind of things, the stink doesn't get better in a week; it gets worse. And so it's compounding, and still Pharaoh is not going. And so God lets it go a week. Now, what's significant about the week? How many days? It probably says the days, right? 7 days. What's significant about 7 days?
God created the earth.
God created the earth in 7 days. 7 days comes into play over and over. 7 days comes into play with the Sabbath. 7, 7, 7, 7. So also the 7 is the complete number. So God had let it roll its course. 7 days are up now. It doesn't always say it's 7 days. Sometimes it's today, it's tomorrow, it's right now. And how those things happen, you can't really have a hailstorm for 7 days and those kind of things. But here, that's also significant in this passage. It was 7 days. And that they can't catch fish, they can't eat fish, can't even go near the river, that you got to dig to get your water. And life has not been good for 7 days. And so I've got about 2 minutes till we probably just need to stop there, because that way we can discuss the whole next thing in its entirety with the frogs. And guess what the frog, that's the next god. If you ever want to go and look it up, what the frog represented to the Egyptians, but we'll talk about that next time. So glad you were on with us. And Jerry did put on there a little bit ago that his father is probably not going to be here by Thanksgiving, so keep praying for them. And we will see you on the next Bible study next Sunday night at 6, or Sunday morning, Wednesday night. Just be with us in whatever way you can. Catch you then.